Good morning and welcome to Heroes and Patriots. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, August 29, 2024, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey, joined by co-host John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our listeners listening to the broadcast live here in Northern California, and to our listeners listening throughout the country and the world on the web stream at kmud.org. Thank you for listening, and thank you for becoming a member or underwriter.
Heroes and Patriots is archived right here at kmud.org on our YouTube and Facebook pages, and you can hear it again on our program website, heroespatriots.org. We're going to spend the next hour continuing a discussion about Project 2025, and with less than 68 days until November's election, we will speak with Andra Watkins. She describes herself as a survivor of Christian nationalism. She is the author of How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life, New York Times bestselling author of the memoir, Not Without My Father, One Woman's 444-mile walk of the Natchez Trace. Thank you so much for being with us, Andra. This is your first time with us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We are so delighted. This is such a hot topic now that was kind of largely ignored by mainstream media, and it's been around for 2 years in the making. Could you tell us, just to give us a little sense of what you mean by surviving Christian nationalism, for our listeners, what exactly is that, and how does it fit into this Project 2025?
Okay, I'll define what it is after I talk about my background. I grew up in rural South Carolina. If you can't tell by now, I've never lived out of the southern U.S. from listening to me talk. So I grew up in a small school with a bigger church that was a Christian nationalist church. It was one of the founding members of Jerry Falwell Sr.'s moral majority movement in the 70s and early 80s. So it was really ground zero of the current iteration of what the Republican Party is trying to do today. I was educated in a school that used textbooks that taught the Christian nationalist history, that America was founded as a Christian nation, that all the founders were Christian, that the Constitution is steeped in the Bible, which is one of the fundamental things Christian nationalists believe. They also, in large part, believe that it was founded as a white Christian nation because people fleeing religious persecution in Europe came here. And so, therefore, white people wrote these things. And so they have a good interface with white supremacists because many of them are white supremacists. They even teach that the Bible says that colored peoples were cursed by God in the story of Noah. And that was taught from the pulpit in the church that I grew up in. That was one of the things that they also used to justify enslaving people in the lead up to the Civil War. So they have both of those beliefs. I was also taught that the founders didn't mean for separation of church and state to protect the state from the church. It was to protect this church from the state. That was fundamental to my education about history and the history of the United States. They believe that the Bible is the inspired, literal, infallible word of God. It is God's law. It is perfect. And they interpret every bit of it literally. So they believe that because it's God's law and it's perfect, any law that man makes that violates their interpretation of God's law has to be overruled, and that they are called by God and charged by God to work to make our human laws match God's perfect law. They are also very uncompromising people because of this belief that they are promoting God's perfect law, and it is their charge by God to make our laws match God's law. So they make horrible politicians who will not compromise. And we've even heard people like Sam Alito saying how we can't compromise our beliefs. So in the hidden recording that they did at one of their parties at the Supreme Court and captured him saying that. So they don't believe in compromise. So I was steeped in all of that dogma growing up and indoctrinated for 14 years in a Christian nationalist school. I attended Liberty University my freshman year of college, which was Jerry Falwell Senior's college.
Right.
So I had a lot of experience with this dogma that has now overtaken the entire Republican Party, as far as I'm concerned, and was very alarmed. I left all that behind 2 decades ago or more and did deconstruction on myself. But when I picked up Project 2025 late last year and started reading it, I was alarmed by the Christian nationalist underpinnings that I saw in it. A couple of mainstream media outlets talked about it in this very academic, inaccessible way. Nobody talked about the Christo-fascist underpinnings of it at all. I read out some portions to my husband and said, "What's wrong with that?" Well, this is from a Bible verse. This is from specific Christian nationalist history and dogma that I was taught. Well, he said, "I would have never known that."
Yeah.
So a lot of people were speed bumping over those horrifying to me things, because for me, Project 2025 is a Christo-fascist manifesto to transform our government from a democracy to a Christian nationalist theocracy. And that is how I started defining it in January when I started writing my Substack, and how I have always talked about it. When I first started doing interviews, people were like, "Are you sure Christo-fascist? I don't know." But now everybody's, that has seeped up into the mainstream interpretation. So I know that my early work, just shrieking about the Christo-fascist elements of it on my Substack, has helped bring that into the forefront of conversation. And I'm really proud of that.
Andra, I worked in law enforcement for the Sheriff's Office here in Mendocino County in Northern California. And so many of our senior commanders, our sheriff and undersheriff and patrol division commanders, etc., have retired to these Christian nationalist little enclaves like in northern Idaho, like Ruby Ridge, or places in Tennessee that I've researched and saw that they were hotbeds of Christian nationalism. What is the connection between some law enforcement and these Christian nationalist communities? How widespread are these Christian nationalist communities? How big is the movement? And where are they located?
First of all, Christian nationalism is a specific outgrowth of Christianity. All Christianity is not Christian nationalism. 20 years or so ago, 98% or some such of Americans identified as Christians or some kind of Christianity. It was really high. Pew did a research study a couple of years ago. 64% of Americans identified as some kind of Christian. And of those Christians, that 64%, 10% of them identified as hardcore radicalized Christian nationalists. And 20% had Christian nationalist sympathies or beliefs or leanings, even though they may not have been hardcore radicalized Christian nationalists. So 30% of 64% is a pretty big chunk of people who identify in some way or another with Christian nationalism. So these enclaves that have cropped up around the country, in out-of-the-way places like northern Idaho, are their attempt to create the world that they want to force on all of us by creating these microcosms of that world wherever they can create these communities. So I don't know why so many people in law enforcement or people with military backgrounds, veterans, are drawn to this Christian nationalist movement. if I look at the Sheriff's Association that promotes constitutional sheriffs, for example, that kind of thinking would be a really big part of a Christian nationalist theocracy, because they would need a huge cache of people on the ground in communities to enforce the laws, the theocratic laws that they would be writing. And those people would need to be empowered to go after people who violated those laws and punish them. So, I don't know what draws a person to having that kind of power, but I'm sure there's a lot of power that you feel that is wrapped up in being drawn to that kind of thinking.
Power trips. And there seems to be a big link not only to ex-military and ex-law enforcement, but also with gun nuts, with these Amendment 2 fanatics. I have one handgun in my household to protect our residents. We live on the corner of two very busy streets, and a dog, but that's it. When I speak to some of my colleagues and former colleagues in law enforcement and the military, they have arsenals. They have 100 guns.
My parents do. They have a gun safe.
What's with that connection between Christian nationalism and just militias?
Okay, when I was a child, our church took a very strong stand against Bob Jones University having their tax-exempt status revoked for not admitting Black people. So our pastor and many pastors like him were horrified that the government might revoke their tax-exempt status. Jerry Falwell Sr. is one of those people. That's really why they chose abortion as a motivating, emotional thing that they could use to rally people to be more politically involved. They couldn't very well come out and say, we're racists who don't want Black people in our churches and schools and universities. And so, we want you to rally around that. That wasn't a good rallying cry. So I remember when that shift happened in my church. I was small, but the pastor started preaching sermons about the evils of government and how government was so liberal and how the government was going to come after our right to worship and our right to meet in church and our right to have Sunday school and our right to talk about Jesus. And I remember, I was probably in second or third grade when he said, someday you might have to take up arms and kill your fellow Americans for the right to worship Jesus. And I remember thinking then, most of our extended family weren't saved. They weren't Christians. So I was sitting there like, well, I have to kill my aunts and uncles. Well, I have to, for me as a child, it was a very traumatic thing to hear. It made an impression on me. Yeah. But you think about all the people who've spent almost 50 years hearing that. Yeah. Version of that. Hearing how everyone's out to get you. Hearing how you're persecuted everywhere. Hearing how, they want to take away your right to be here. They want to take your right to worship and your right to believe and your right to gather and your right to assemble and all of that. That's a lot of what was underneath their COVID resistance, for instance. They used that fear of government telling them they couldn't assemble that had been around for decades in those churches and convinced people, that COVID wasn't real. So there's a big element of fear of persecution, fear of being told you can't worship that has gone into building these arsenals of guns. Wow. Over the course of decades, which of course the gun industry has loved and benefited from. Right. But I grew up in the South. I know people who hunt. I know what that culture is like. I've been around guns my whole life, and I know people who have them to hunt deer and whatever. And I'm grateful for those people. Sometimes they share with me, but that was the culture in the South in the 70s and 80s. But it has morphed to, I need guns all over the place to protect myself from the people who are going to come and tell me I can't worship and I can't assemble and I can't do this and that and the other thing. And after 9/11, that morphed even more into, we need to protect ourselves from all these Muslims who are coming here and all these people who aren't like us. And, that was a big flash in accelerating that as well.
And morphed.
So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, and morphed into the militia movement as well, correct?
Yeah.
I
mean, the Ku Klux Klan was a form of militia movement before things like the Oath Keepers and 10 percenters and whatever happened. But, it was just a 21st century kind of militia movement as opposed to ones we'd seen in other centuries.
It's 17 minutes past the hour. If you would like to ask a question of our guest, Andra Watkins, the number to call, 707-923-3911. You talked about your background and some of the things that you experienced. If you could take that into now, what is Project 2025 and who are the principals? Who's funding it? How is it progressing or not?
And what do they believe?
Project 2025 started in Mandate for Leadership started in 1979. The Heritage Foundation, which is a far right, I'd call them a fascist think tank, but they're a nonprofit, and they were at the end of the Carter administration and wondering what would happen if we could elect a conservative president. How could we set ourselves up to make a conservative administration be more effective? So they wrote the first Mandate for Leadership, and in 1981, Ronald Reagan got a hold of it and implemented over half of it in his administration. So every 4 years, the Heritage Foundation spearheaded a project to write another one of these mandates for leadership. They've done them every 4 years since 1979. So when they got conservatives in power, they were able to get some of it implemented. In 2016, Donald Trump implemented 60-something% of that version of Project 2025 that none of us had even heard of and didn't know existed.
Right.
So Project 2025 to me is the culmination of everything they'd like to see happen in a conservative government and environment in America. It's the culmination of all the work they've started doing since 1979. You get Reagan to implement over 50% of your mandate for leadership. So you're able to move the bar further to the right with the next one in terms of what you want to see accomplished. So rather than going for all of it the first time, they went through phases. We also had this change in evangelicalism in the 90s where this dominionist movement became big. And so that's a different thing from the evangelical movement that I grew up in, where they believe that they have to change the whole country and transform the whole world into this Christian nationalist Mecca so that Jesus can return.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of people now in Christian nationalism who are radicalized with that kind of thinking.
Right.
So that all feeds into how the Heritage Foundation has morphed and changed. They're funded by primarily fossil fuel oligarchs who don't really care what people believe as their faith, but want to make money and don't want to pay tax on it and want no regulations. So a movement like Christian nationalism is a really good way to control people.
Yeah.
So that they can keep doing their greedy, make money, not pay taxes, not have regulation structure that they want. And they won't have to live by these rules. Everybody else will. So that is what has imbued Project 2025. It's their Christo-fascist manifesto. It's their moonshot. It's everything they want to see happen in this country. And it won't go away if they're defeated in November. They'll regroup and they'll try to attack it from a different direction. This isn't something that we're going to defeat. They've worked on this for almost 50 years. Yeah, they're not going to give up.
Yeah, it's not
in one election.
Administration. It's something that's playing out underneath, and perhaps they picked him to launch this because he's such a buffoon. I don't know. We have a caller. I'd like to get their question, and then we can pick up with this thread after the call. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Oh, morning. Yeah, your guest is pretty smart about this. If you study the old Inquisition, the Dark Ages, there are a lot of books that were written showing that there was a criminality to the Inquisition, and that these people would use the confessional to start an investigation. Then they would cash in on it, and they basically steal everything that a person owned and call it cleansing it. That somebody was in league with the devil, and that the church had to clean their property. And then, of course, the people, if they ended up alive, they'd be lucky. But the inquisitor, the judges, their hired help, they'd all get a piece of the action. And if you study the abortion, there's an interesting book that was written. It was a biography of by Kitty Kelly of Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra's mother was an abortionist. She was one of the biggest abortionists near New York City. And with every abortion, you would get a free extortion, blackmail. And so the people that got abortions from Frank Sinatra's mother would be trapped with organized crime for the rest of their lives. And it wasn't just the woman. It could be her husband. It could be her brother. It could be her father. It could be anybody in their family could be blackmailed. And it got to such a point that part of the Roe v. Wade decision was based on freeing America from this trap. And that there were diplomats, there were generals that had mistresses or wives or daughters that had abortions, and that top secrets were being given over to mysterious organized crime people, and that America's life was on the line because of a single abortion. Top secrets could be lost, and so it's written up in the book by Bob Woodward, The Brethren, about how this whole thing. There's a whole chapter on Roe v. Wade in that book. So I admire your guest for knowing so much about this. There's these people who are so pious are just lying phonies who are trying to rob the nation blind with their so-called piety. Their pretense of one thing is really a gateway to a much darker way of life.
All right.
I love this comment because so many people who talk about this moment we're in compare it with the rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler. I wrote a long newsletter comparing it to the Inquisition and the lead up to the Inquisition, because this is a cycle that humanity just keeps repeating. And so I wanted to use a different lens because the Christian nationalist movement that's fueling this has two components. It has radicalized Catholics who are affiliated with Opus Dei, and Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation now, and Leonard Leo. They are both affiliated with Opus Dei, which is a radicalized group of Catholics. And then you have Protestants like Mike Johnson, who are affiliated with a different thing. And I wrote about the Inquisition to point out, the Inquisition led to the 30 Years' War, which slaughtered untold thousands and thousands of Europeans, and really led to the founding of this country and people fleeing. But, those wars and arguments were over whose faith was the truth.
Yeah.
And we would have the same problem here if Christian nationalists got control, because they don't believe the same things about who's going to heaven. So they would have to then have a holy war over who was going to have power. Is it going to be Catholics or is it going to be Protestants? So we'd be doing all this again.
Yeah, and
if they win.
Eric Prince as well.
Yeah.
A member of Opus Dei, a radicalized Catholic, kind of Christian nationalist, who was the number one, military contractor, private contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan. Got billions of dollars worth of contracts. Now, I know a little something about that because I was once a contractor myself. I was hired by Buzzy Krongard, who was nominally the head of Alex Brown and Sons, but secretly the number 3 guy at the CIA. His brother was the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. So you had these guys at the very, very top, these Christian nationalists, number 3 guy at the CIA, Inspector General of the Department of Defense, and the number 1 private contractor in Afghanistan and Iraq, all radicalized extremists.
Right. It's 28 minutes past the hour. If you just tuned in, this is Heroes and Patriots, and our guest this hour is Andra Watkins. She's the writer of the Substack, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. We have another caller, Andra. Let's take that and then pick up on the other side. Caller, go ahead.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Watkins, thank you so much for this really important show and your deep historical perspective. I wanted to ask you, though, looking forward with the changing demographics in the United States and as we become more of a majority country, what that's going to do to projects like the Christian Nationalist Movement and Project 21's hopes for the future. And at the same time, with younger people being more skeptical, hopefully keeping that skepticism, just what are the forces at work that might serve to reduce the impact of this or increase it?
People say that we are at an inflection point with our demographics, that by 2030, they're going to have to change. They're going to start having a shift, like the caller said. And so I really feel like Project 2025 is everything they want to accomplish because they know they're running out of time. And the quicker they can accomplish all of it, the more time they will have. One of Project 2025's most disturbing things to me that almost nobody talks about, they talk around it, is this idea of forcing religious indoctrination into every aspect of our lives. People talk about doing away with the Department of Education, but they don't talk about the fact that that goal is there to force children into Christian nationalist indoctrination as early as possible. So in public schools, they would be getting indoctrinated in this kind of thinking. And that happened to me. I know how powerful it is. I know how deep it goes. I know how hard it is to escape. And so do they. So that's one of the reasons why their goal is to do away with the Department of Education so that all children can be forced into Christian nationalist religious indoctrination in public schools. That'll be the only option. But they also work that into getting welfare assistance, avoiding jail time for minor crimes that one commits, addiction, homelessness, all of these things that people need assistance for would come with the requirement that you meet all these religious indoctrination type tools. And so much of that exists already in our country. We have such a terrible social safety net. In the southern United States, particularly, to go to a homeless shelter, it's almost 100% of the time going to be run by some religious group. And you're going to have to do things like attend chapel or attend Bible studies or read the Bible and write an essay about it, or meet with some counselor who's not a therapist or any kind of trained person. They're just a Christian who's volunteering their time to read the Bible and pray with you. So Project 2025 really wants to make that be our social safety net and make that be the requirement for getting help. And all of that exists. These changing demographics to make sure that we are indoctrinating people to be Christian nationalists as young as possible. and to give people very few ways of escaping that kind of indoctrination in our lives so that they can keep white men who they believe God imbues with the leadership in power and in control. So that's why somebody like Russ Vought would say we need to be looking at immigration and not letting in people who aren't Christian. We need to cleanse the country. And, we have our own cleansing to do internally with all this religious indoctrination we want to do to make everybody who's already here live according to our rules and directives. But we also need to keep people out who don't prescribe to that.
Right.
So that's really what's driving we don't want immigrants from the people who are leading it. The people who are following that don't realize that. But that's what's driving it by the people who are leading it.
Could you speak to how this is impacting, or if it isn't, the Supreme Court and the judges that have been put forth? It's a lifetime appointment. How is this impacting the Supreme Court?
And the decision in July by the Supreme Court that seemed to open the door to a lot of this Christian nationalist agenda.
Well, the 6 justices are all Catholic. They're all practicing Catholics, the conservative ones.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that someone like Sam Alito is a dominionist Catholic who, was taught to hide his more radical views until he got into a position of power on his mountaintop, the 7 mountain mandate that the dominionists follow, and then use his position of power to force the world to become what Jesus would want to return to. So he and Clarence Thomas especially I see as highly radicalized that way. But the others all share those beliefs and have been happy once they had a majority to force a much more radicalized vision and interpretation of the Constitution on Americans than I think any of us thought they might do before this happened. Right. So how that aligns with what they ruled in July about presidential immunity, Project 2025 imbues all power and authority in the president. They repeatedly state the president's agenda is what matters. And the president sets the agenda for all organizations within government, everyone within the executive branch. The president's agenda takes supremacy. So it essentially makes the president a dictator. It gives the president the power of an autocrat. Mm-hmm. So their ruling that he has this unlimited immunity really opened the door for them to implement Project 2025 on Inauguration Day. They removed the hurdle that says the president doesn't have complete power and authority. So if a conservative president wins, they can come in on Inauguration Day and sign an executive order to fire whoever they want to fire, for example, and gut the government of people who will say no to following the president's agenda, whatever it is, without question, because that's what they repeatedly state that they want to hire. A person's job in government is not to make sure that we're following the Constitution, that we're following the rule of law. A person's job in Project 2025 government is to obey and follow the president's agenda without question.
Wow.
And so the Supreme Court knows this. The conservative justices know this. So they happily gave a conservative president the keys to do that.
And Trump now seems to be wanting to distance himself from Project 2025. He doesn't want to be associated with it. He says that's a spin by the liberal media to associate him with Christian nationalists, etc. What's the truth? What is the connection between Trump and the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025?
Well, multiple media outlets have made those connections. I and my readers worked together to do a big spreadsheet, which was one of the first ones that was done to show those connections. There are almost 250 contributors to Project 2025. We found connections directly to Trump's administration. They had served in his administration. And over 100 of them, I think it was something like 140 of them, had somehow served in his former administration. But we also found connections to 4 people who had clerked for Samuel Alito. One had clerked for him twice, once when he was an appellate judge and once as a Supreme Court justice. One had clerked for Clarence Thomas. One had clerked for Eileen Cannon, who just threw out the documents case. One had clerked for Judge James Ho, who's on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of their favorite places to shop and take cases that they want to queue up for the Supreme Court, because it's such a far-right radical appellate court, given the transformations that Trump made to it during his administration. So we found connections to all kinds of people. And I know that everyone wants to talk about Trump's connections to Project 2025. I don't even like to say his name. On my Substack, I write 45 because I don't even like to say his name. We talk too much about him because it's just, he knows how to put on a good reality show. But behind him are the people we should be terrified of and be talking a lot more about. So I spent a lot more time talking about the Heritage Foundation and people within the Heritage Foundation, the people, the Republicans whose people worked on Project 2025, who had been chiefs of staff for people like Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, people who were so at the forefront of this far-right movement in our Congress. It's important that people realize that this isn't just about defeating Trump. This is the Republican Party today. And it's the Republican Party at every level of government today. And so talking about Trump's ties to it is fine, but it's the Republican Party.
Right.
And Americans and voters really must understand that.
Tell me about the military aspect, our military, the Pentagon. Of course, this program addresses national security, foreign policy, and intelligence. How does this plan play into those aspects of our security and our foreign policies and so forth? And what kinds of monies are being filtered to the Pentagon?
Project 2025, again, every government entity would follow the president's agenda. So the notion that the president could completely control the military and order them to do things that none of us would think possible, is possible, because he would have complete authority and control. I mean, he is the commander in chief now, the president is, but there is an independence and leadership and military and an understanding and a separation. In the past, the president has always deferred to, military leaders to make the large majority of the decisions that get made about the military. So that wouldn't be the case with Project 2025. We would absolutely pull out of NATO. We would not fund NATO at all anymore. And we would stiff our allies if this happens. So foreign policy, on that front, we would destroy our relationships with many of our long-term allies immediately. Project 2025 also calls for our primary enemy and focus to be against China. And while there are reasons that I agree with that, the billionaires behind Project 2025 care about China because of money and China's espionage in terms of hitting them with their ability to make money. So, to me, China as an enemy is framed as an economic enemy and not as a aggressive, military enemy as much. But Project 2025 calls for a heavy reinvestment in nuclear capabilities. Wow. So, the primary focus in our weaponry and in our arming ourselves to defeat China, to deter China, would be a vast growth in nuclear weapons, existing nuclear technologies, and a huge investment in developing new nuclear technologies. So it shouldn't make anyone feel good to have somebody like Trump in control over those buttons when you know that people, would be immediately investing in a lot more nuclear power and capability and wouldn't have the guardrails in place to stop someone who was a maniac or a mad person from hitting one of those buttons and ordering one of them to be used.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed this out, Andra. I've really taken great pause about the Christian nationalist movement as it pertains to curtailing the rights of women and reproductive rights and LGBT rights, etc. But on the international scale, it seems as if the Christian nationalist movement is headed in the direction of end times. It's headed in the direction of Armageddon, and they want to make sure that we're armed to the teeth for end times. Am I misreading this, or is there?
No, you're not misreading it at all. And that's another reason why they don't care about the environment. Why care about the future of the planet if God's going to destroy the planet? And in the vein of Christian nationalism that I grew up in that Armageddon end times theology. So they believe that 1948 started the clock for the end times when Israel was reformed as a nation. So we are living in the end times. I heard that all the time. So dominionists believe about the end times differently, but the end result is the same. God's going to destroy the planet. So why do we need to take care of it? God's going to destroy it when it's God's time, and we can't do that as human beings. So they actually see all this unrest and all this discord. Somebody in my life called me and said, "I'm so sorry that we're living in the end times, and I'm going to die soon, and you're just going to have a really hard life, and it's going to be so hard, and I'm just going to, but almost like they were happy to see all of this unfolding, and that it validated their belief in the end times. So the more unrest and insecurity and conflict that happens, they don't blame climate change. They don't believe in climate change. It's God judging the planet. It's God judging things. So it really very much ties into their worldview, and even things like their foreign policy, where during Trump's term, they moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this is why.
Talk about that.
This is why.
Yeah, talk about that connection to Israel. Why was the formation of Israel as a nation state so key to this theology, this end time theology?
Well, in the New Testament, Jesus talked about, he did the parable of fig tree, and it talked about a fig tree losing all of its branches and its leaves and whatever. But when the fig tree puts forth new branches and new leaves, you'll know that the end is nigh. And so people have interpreted that parable as the reformation of the nation of Israel. And they directly cite this parable. Even though in other places Jesus said, you'll not know the day or the hour, and people who say a day or an hour are not right, they will always be not right. But because he said you can know the season, there'll be wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilences. But we've always had those things.
Yeah.
So, but you're conditioned when you grow up in that environment to interpret everything on the news through this apocalyptic lens of, here's another thing that's happening that the Bible says is going to happen. We must be getting closer to the end. And people in those congregations get very excited about seeing these things happen. So the nation of Israel plays a big role in this Armageddon end times dogma, where a person called the Antichrist becomes a one world leader and sets up his rule from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a key piece of end times theology, and therefore people who surrounded Trump in his last administration who adhere to this theology wanted to go ahead and put our embassy there, so that we could be ready for that eventuality. So you have people making decisions about our lives and our planet and our safety, who the only thing that matters to them is interpreting everything through this lens, and that's horrifying.
It is.
Yeah, I've met private contractors in the Middle East, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and in Israel, who privately believe, they keep their opinions to themselves, but they privately believe that the battlefield, with the Antichrist, will be in Israel, and
in the Valley of Megiddo. Yes,
exactly, and they are all for Israel having 400 nuclear warheads, nuclear devices. They view Iran, as the great Satan, just as Iran views us as the great Satan. The polarization in this part of the world, and believe me, Christian nationalism does not help, is extreme.
But it goes even deeper than that with this particular Republican Party's theology, because growing up, I was also taught that Russia would be part of that invasion.
Right.
So Russia has to be strong. For this prophecy to come true, Russia would have to defeat Ukraine. They would have to keep winning so that they could continue to be strong enough to invade Israel as part of this end times prophecy.
Right.
So when I saw the Republican Party start turning against helping Ukraine, I was just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, isn't there
this is part of that?
Isn't there a Christian nationalist movement in Russia itself?
Well, all autocrats use some kind of religion to control people. So, while I don't know how Orthodox religion works in Russia at all, I do know that these rules about morality are things that Vladimir Putin and his regime do try to enforce there.
Andra, as we only have 10 more minutes with you, tell
what
our
can we do?
Tell our listeners, what can we do, and what our listeners need to know as we go into the presidential election season. Again, what this Christian nationalist agenda, how this will play out with reproductive rights, with LGBT rights, with the rights of women in marriage, etc. What do we need to know as voters?
Voters need to accept and understand that they're serious, that they will do this, even though many of us can't imagine it and think, oh, that'll never happen. They will do every bit of this if they gain power. So they will outlaw abortion nationwide. They will outlaw IVF because they believe life begins at fertilization and IVF kills human life. They will outlaw most forms of contraception because in their groups, they classify things like the birth control pill as an abortifacient. So no abortifacient will be legal. They will outlaw same-sex marriage, and they will drive the LGBTQ community back into the closet. They will criminalize abortion. They will criminalize being LGBTQ or transgender. They will make it impossible to be transgender. They will outlaw most forms of divorce because they believe the only way you're able to get divorced is because of adultery, and any other reason for divorce is not biblical. And they believe that people need to stay married and be married. And the only kind of marriage they recognize as valid is one man married to one unrelated woman who have as many children as God gives them. And so they will make it virtually impossible to get out of marriages when you're unhappily married, which, affects so many people. And it's hard to believe that they would go that far and do things like that. But then you listen to some of the things that J.D. Vance says, and I don't know how people think that he's not serious or that how they don't take him seriously. So Project 2025 will fundamentally change our government. We will not be able to just vote that out in 2 years. We'll never have an election again, probably in our lifetimes, that is normal. And so we won't be able to just change our minds in 2026 and vote somebody else in. This is a fundamental alteration of our government and our society. And red states are already implementing so much of Project 2025. You're in California and somewhat insulated from this. But if you live in a red state, Florida and Texas, South Carolina, where I am, you're already living in a chunk of the world that Project 2025 envisions for us. You know, they always target people that the rest of us don't care about to start doing these rules, but don't think that it won't come for you, because it will. So it's vital that Americans take this seriously and believe them when they say these things.
And what is a concept called ordered liberty? What does that mean, ordered liberty?
Ordered liberty is a concept that Leonard Leo stumbled upon when he was in the Federalist Society and trying to come up with ways to put the conservative lens on the Constitution. And so ordered liberty is this concept where people who control the government control God's revenge on wrongdoers, and that God means for the order in society to be this order, that these God's chosen people will dole out that kind of liberty and decide what liberty means, because you can't be completely free. You know, God gives us free will, but also has a moral order for society. And they believe that ordered liberty is it's another word for that Christian nationalist morality, that moral order that they want to impose on everyone.
So if they're voted in, then this means that their ideas, their interpretation of liberty is imposed on us. Their interpretation of governance, of self-governance, is imposed upon us. The government has no administrative oversight. There are no checks and balances. It's all imposed upon us. Why don't you take it away? Take away the show on that theme, and we'll close out with that.
Christian nationalists have fought to control the government for all these decades because they believe whoever controls the government is God's avenger. They draw that from verses in Romans. And so, if they control the government, they get to say what is ordered liberty, what is morality, what are the rules going to be, and then they get to be God's avengers to enforce that order. And they will do it as avengers. So every time I see that phrase, it scares me. Because it will mean that they control every aspect of our society because of their views about sex, which are so tied up in their views of morality. They believe they have a right to be in our bedrooms because they believe God says if two people commit sexual immorality in a city, the whole city needs to be judged by God. So they don't believe sexual decisions are private. They believe they have a right to be in our bedrooms deciding all of those things. So this change will impact every person in our society in some way, because even who you have sex with, or if you decide you want to have sex with yourself, that's not allowed anymore.
Wow.
And they will go to great lengths to make sure that's not happening so that they can please God by being God's avengers.
Andra, how can folks follow you, keep up with this, the progress of this serious issue? How can they find you? Could you give us some information how they might do that?
I have a Substack called How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. The URL is Project 2025 is theocracy.substack.com. After the election, we'll see what direction I go with that work. Project 2025 doesn't have an expiration date, so there'll be more to do after the election.
Wow. Yeah, and we agree with you. This election is probably the most important election of our lifetime. The decisions we make this November at the ballot box, not only in the presidential election but also in all the congressional races as well, will set the stage probably for the rest of our lifetimes. We want to thank you so much, Andra, for being a guest on our show, and hope that you come back perhaps after the election.
Well, I'd love to if you have me. I've loved meeting you and being with you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our guest today has been Andra Watkins. She has written for Substack on how Project 2025 will change our lives and our children's lives. And it's been a very interesting, informative. I've loved the historical perspective that you brought to this. So thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, once again, you can follow our guest's work at Project 2025 is Theocracy Substack. That's the link. Go right to it. Very articulate, very knowledgeable, and in a way, a kind of a prophet.
Here.
You do your own parents proud by speaking truth to power. So,
they wouldn't say that, but I say that.
We're going to say it.
Okay. Thank you so much. And
thank you. A prophet is never loved in her own land. You know that, right?
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is our show for today. We'll be back first Thursday in September, right after Labor Day. So have a good week, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.